The bell in Lancaster struck midnight, but in the Brennan farmhouse no one slept. The coffin still rested in the parlor, its wood dark as river mud. Candles burned so low they hissed in their own wax. Patrick Brennan had been lowered into the earth that afternoon, yet his presence clung to the walls like smoke. Four daughters sat in silence around the kitchen table. No priest, no neighbor lingered. Just sisters, their mourning dresses stiff with rain, their hands folded in a way that looked more like waiting than grief. The storm outside rattled the shutters. Wind pressed itself against the house until it moaned like a living thing. A kettle hissed on the stove, forgotten. And then, without anyone moving, a question hung in the room. What now? Bridget, eldest at 30, leaned forward. She was not beautiful in the way townsfolk whispered about, but there was a sharpness in her features, a severity that commanded. Her hair, loosened from hours of damp air, framed a face that had already calculated the days ahead. The farm, the 200 acres of fields and stone walls, was not only land to her. It was survival. It was power. It was the Brennan name carved into soil. He's gone, Bridget said at last, her voice steady, too steady. And the law will come knocking. Catherine, only a year younger, rested her chin on her palm, eyes half closed. Unlike Bridget, Catherine carried softness like a weapon. She knew how to smile until men forgot their sense. She had learned long ago that beauty, properly wielded, could be more dangerous than a blade. Her lips curved now, not in amusement, but in thought. They'll divide it, she murmured. For daughters, no sons. It will be cut into quarters like a carcass. The youngest, Sarah, gave a small shudder at the word. 17, still more girl than woman, her fingers twisted in her lap. She glanced toward the parlor door where their father's coffin rested. The storm seemed to deepen around them, as if it too awaited the decision. Margaret, the third sister, said nothing. She sat apart, a journal closed beside her hand, her eyes trained on the flame of the nearest candle. Her silence had always unnerved the others. Where Bridget sharpened into command and Catherine glided into charm, Margaret observed. She collected words the way other women collected fabric, stitching them into thoughts she rarely voiced. At last Bridget's hand struck the table. Do you want to see the farm sold off? Strangers plowing our father's fields? A legacy traded for coins. The question snapped the air taut. No one answered at once. From the rafters came a slow drip of rainwater, each drop like a tick of a clock counting down. Catherine's eyes glittered in the candlelight. Sarah bit her lip until it bled. Margaret closed her journal and folded her hands over it, as if guarding something unseen. Bridget leaned in, her voice low, urgent. The law is written by men. Men who never cared if a woman kept her bloodline intact. But there are ways around it. We will not beg. We will not scatter like hens. We will keep this house, this land, whole. And how? Catherine asked, though her tone was not skeptical. It was curious, intrigued. Bridget's gaze swept over them, steady, cold. We marry. We marry well. And we ensure, by chance or by God's hand, that those husbands do not live long enough to divide us. The words landed like stones in a pond, heavy, rippling outward. Sarah gasped, half rising from her chair. Sister, you speak of murder. No, Bridget corrected, her voice sharp as flint. I speak of survival. What the law steals from us, we take back. A slip on ice. A fall from a horse. Accidents happen. Accidents are not crimes. The wind screamed against the house, rattling the coffin lid in the next room. Sarah pressed her hands to her ears as if to block out both wind and words. Catherine's lips curled again, this time in a slow, dangerous smile. And if people suspect? Catherine asked, tilting her head. Let them, Bridget replied. Who would dare accuse four grieving daughters? Men will weep for us before they question us. That is our armor. Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced through the room. You would bind us to a pact written in blood. Bridget's eyes flicked to her. I would bind us to a pact that saves what father built. The silence that followed was worse than argument. The candles guttered, casting their faces into shifting masks of light and shadow. Each sister weighed the words differently. Catherine saw opportunity, a stage where her charm could turn sympathy into power. Sarah saw damnation, sin draped over her shoulders like a shroud. Margaret saw a chasm opening, one she was already standing too close to. And Bridget saw inevitability, Calculation made flesh. The storm broke then, a thunderclap that shook the panes, as though the heavens themselves had heard and judged. Sarah jumped. Catherine laughed softly, almost delighting in the omen. Bridget rose, her shadow towering against the wall, and reached for the bottle of whiskey their father had hidden in the cupboard. She poured 4 glasses, the liquid amber in the candlelight. She set them down, one before each sister, her hand firm. "We swear tonight," she said. "No man will divide us. No law will strip us. The Brennan sisters will stand together, no matter the cost." Her eyes dared them to refuse. Catherine lifted her glass first. "To inheritance," she whispered, and drank. Margaret stared at hers for a long moment before taking it, the glass cold in her hand. She did not drink, but she held it. Sarah's hands trembled so hard she nearly spilled. Tears glittered on her cheeks, yet under Bridget's relentless gaze, she raised the glass. The 4 sisters clinked the rims together, a sound that seemed to echo too loudly in the kitchen. A vow unspoken, yet sealed. Outside, the storm eased. The wind fell quiet, the rain softening to a drizzle. It was as if the world, having witnessed their pact, no longer needed to rage. In the parlor, the coffin sat unmoving, but those who swore that night would later say the candles guttered all at once, plunging the dead man's room into darkness. The Brennan sisters did not notice. They sat together, 4 women against the world, a new hunger igniting in their chests. What none of them knew, what none of them could know, was how far that hunger would carry them, or how many graves it would dig along the way. Since Section 1 ended with the sisters' pact, this section will slowly build tension, showing how they begin living under that vow, deepening their character dynamics, and planting suspicion in the world around them. This is the calm before the first accident, suspense, atmosphere, and emotional depth. Morning broke gray and reluctant over Lancaster County. The storm had washed the fields clean, leaving the farm hushed, as if the land itself listened to what had been spoken in the dark. Dew clung to the cornstalks. Crows picked silently at the edges of the yard. And inside the stone farmhouse, 4 sisters moved with the same rhythm as before, yet everything had changed. Bridget was first to rise. She always was. She tied her hair back, rolled her sleeves, and lit the stove as if tending fire could banish doubt. The kitchen smelled of damp wood and last night's whiskey. She poured water into the kettle, her movements sharp, deliberate. When Catherine drifted in, her hair perfectly unpinned for effect, she found Bridget already writing lists. Names, supplies, debts owed. "You've started early," Catherine murmured, yawning. "There's no time for sleep now," Bridget replied. She didn't look up. "Men with claim to this farm will be sniffing around before the month is done. We must be prepared." Catherine leaned against the doorframe, watching her sister. There was a chill in Bridget's focus, a hardness that Catherine both admired and feared. She reached for an apple from the basket and bit into it, letting the juice run along her lips. "And what would you have me do?" she asked, voice playful. "Charm," Bridget said simply. "Charm is your weapon. Use it. Doors will open for you that will not for me." The words landed like an instruction, not a compliment. Catherine swallowed her bite and smiled thinly. She knew Bridget meant it. She also knew Bridget's eyes never softened anymore. They only measured. Upstairs, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, knees tucked to her chest. Her prayer book lay unopened beside her. She stared out the window at the fields, the wet stalks gleaming in pale light. The pact from the night before replayed in her mind like a bell she couldn't unhear. She whispered the rosary under her breath, though her lips trembled on every word. She could not pray the vow away. Margaret, by contrast, opened her journal. Her handwriting filled page after page. Observations, doubts, fragments of dreams. She recorded Bridget's exact words, "No man will divide us." She described Catherine's smile as she raised her glass. She wrote of Sarah's tears and of her own silence. Each entry felt like a secret ledger of their souls, as though putting it into ink could keep her sane. By midday, the sisters gathered in the yard. The sun had broken through weakly, turning puddles into mirrors. Their father's absence was everywhere, the hollow sound of the barn without his whistle, the fields without his broad-shouldered figure. For a moment, the enormity of their loss cracked through their ambitions, and they stood together, for dark silhouettes against the wide sky. But grief quickly gave way to resolve. Bridget spoke of plans. Catherine teased out ideas for visits into town. Sarah argued softly about sin and punishment, only to be silenced by Bridget's cutting look. Margaret said nothing, but her eyes lingered on each sister, as if memorizing who they were before the path consumed them. That evening, neighbors arrived with condolences, baskets of bread, jars of preserves, words rehearsed for funerals. The Brennan sisters played their parts well. Bridget thanked with dignity. Catherine smiled with softness. Sarah clung to her prayer book. Margaret stayed quiet. But behind the door, once the visitors had gone, their faces changed. Masks dropped. The sisters sat in silence until Bridget finally said, "Do you see? They pity us already. Pity blinds. They will not suspect." Catherine laughed lightly. "You wear widowhood well already, Bridget. Perhaps too well." Bridget's eyes narrowed, but she let the jest pass. Weeks slipped into each other. The farm demanded attention. Harvest had to be taken in, debts negotiated, livestock tended. The sisters worked like soldiers in a campaign. Every task was purposeful, every gesture rehearsed. Their pact was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was the unspoken law of the household. Bridget carried herself like a matriarch, her voice clipped, her orders unquestioned. She began visiting the solicitor in Lancaster, asking pointed questions about trusts and titles. Catherine started attending church socials with renewed interest, her eyes scanning not just for gossip, but for eligible men with land or wealth. Sarah grew quieter, her prayers longer, her sleep more restless. And Margaret watched it all, recording in her journal, torn between loyalty and dread. One night, Sarah crept into Margaret's room. She clutched her prayer book so tightly the leather bent. "Do you think God heard us?" she whispered, eyes wide. Margaret closed her journal slowly. "God hears everything." "Then we are doomed," Sarah breathed. Margaret studied her youngest sister, the way fear hollowed her cheeks, the way her hands shook. She wanted to comfort her, but the words would not come. Instead, she reached out, took Sarah's trembling hand, and held it until the girl's breathing steadied. Still, she wrote the moment down after Sarah left, as if to confess to the page what she could not confess aloud. As autumn deepened, whispers began to stir beyond the farmhouse. Farmers at the tavern muttered that the Brennan girls had grown hard, too hard, since Patrick's death. The solicitor mentioned Bridget's pointed questions with a trace of unease. The priest noticed Sarah's hollow eyes at Massachusetts. But no one spoke directly. They pitied. They assumed grief. They underestimated. Catherine, meanwhile, began to draw attention in town. She lingered too long at the mercer's shop, let men carry her parcels, laughed at jokes she did not find amusing. Bridget watched her with something like pride and something like warning. "Choose wisely," Bridget reminded her. "We need more than charm. We need security." Catherine's lips curved. "Don't worry, sister. I know exactly what we need." On the farm, nights grew longer. The four sisters would sit by the hearth, the firelight painting their faces in flickering orange. Sometimes they played cards, sometimes they sat in silence. But always, beneath the ordinary rhythms, there was a pulse of something darker, a waiting, a readiness, as though each sister knew the next step would be irreversible. One evening, as wind rattled the windows and snow threatened, Bridget spoke words that chilled them all. "The time will come sooner than you think, and when it does, we must not flinch." Sarah crossed herself, lips trembling. Catherine only smiled faintly, eyes glinting like a cat's. Margaret lowered her gaze to her journal, her pen scratching out the sentence she could not say aloud. "The pact breathes now. It has a life of its own." Outside, the fields lay bare under the cold moon. A silence stretched across the land, thick and expectant, as if the soil itself waited for what would be sown next. "Got it. We're now moving into Section 3, 1,000 words, the midpoint twist." Sections 1 and 2 built the atmosphere and the pact. Now the story must pivot with the first death, which shocks the audience and sets the irreversible tone. This will also deepen Margaret's inner conflict, planting seeds of betrayal, while showing how the sisters handle their first real crime. The morning broke with a fog so thick it seemed the world had been erased. The trees, the fences, even the outline of the barn dissolved into pale gray. The farmhouse itself looked like an island adrift in a sea of cloud. It was the kind of morning when sound traveled strangely, muffled, close, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Bridget stood by the window, arms crossed. She had not slept. All night, she had turned the plan over in her head until it burned like coals. Today was not a day of words. Today would be proof. Thomas Hennessy arrived on horseback just after dawn, his figure emerging from the mist like something summoned. He was a man of order, Lancaster's solicitor, steady-handed, a widower with enough wealth and reputation to silence gossip. He had courted Bridget with respect, charmed by her practical nature, unaware that her sharp mind was measuring him not as a lover, but as an investment. When he dismounted, Bridget stepped outside to meet him. Her dress was plain but immaculate, her hair braided tight against the damp. "You came early," she said, voice steady. "A busy day at the office," he replied, smiling faintly. "But for you, I make time." Catherine, watching from the window, smirked. "For her," she murmured. Sarah stood behind her, pale and tense, clutching her rosary as if beads alone could anchor her. Margaret scribbled in her journal by the hearth, each stroke of her pen heavy. She was recording every detail, the fog, the hour, the look on Bridget's face. Some part of her knew these words would matter later, though she could not yet say how. By mid-morning, the engagement was announced. Neighbors, summoned by rumor, arrived to offer congratulations. Bridget played the role of the bride-to-be with ease, a smile that was polite but not foolish, gratitude delivered with just enough warmth. Hennessy was proud, unaware that his name was already being folded into the Brennan ledger like an entry on a page. Sarah sat rigid during the gathering, her face pale as parchment. When Catherine leaned close and whispered, "Don't look so mournful, sister. People will think you've lost instead of gained," Sarah nearly broke. She fled to the garden, clutching her prayer book, whispering furiously into the soil. That night, when the neighbors had gone and the house was quiet, Bridget entered the kitchen alone. The others followed, summoned without words. She placed a small vial on the table. The glass glinted in the lamplight, clear as water. Sarah recoiled. "No, please, Bridget, not like this." Bridget's expression didn't flicker. "Do you think accidents happen by prayer alone? This is how we survive." Catherine leaned forward, studying the vial with curiosity rather than fear. "And how?" Bridget explained in hushed tones. "A dosage in wine, a weakening of the body, an encouragement to take the horse on a fog-thick morning. Nothing certain, nothing traceable. The world would do the rest." Margaret's stomach twisted. She tried to speak, but the words stuck. In her mind, she saw Hennessy's kind eyes, the way he smiled when he spoke of law as though it were sacred. She wanted to scream, to protest, but Bridget's eyes caught hers, hard, unyielding. To resist now would be to declare war on her own blood. So Margaret said nothing. She only wrote later, by candlelight, "Tonight I saw my sister place death on the table, and none of us turned away." Days later, the plan unfurled. The fog returned like a curtain lowered by some invisible hand. Bridget pressed the cup into Hennessy's palm, her smile practiced, her words tender. He drank without question. Hours later, weakened, he insisted on taking the horse out. He always rode in the mornings, he said, to clear his mind. Bridget let him go. The sisters waited in silence, each with different thoughts. Catherine hummed faintly by the window, as though she were watching a play. Sarah knelt in the corner, rosary slipping from her trembling fingers. Margaret paced, her journal clutched to her chest, every creak of the floorboards ringing like a guilty bell. Then the sound came, a frantic pounding of hooves, a horse screaming in panic. The mare burst from the fog alone, reins trailing, eyes wide, foam at her mouth. Sarah cried out. Catherine's smile flickered wider. Bridget stood still, unblinking. The search party found Hennessy broken on the road. His neck snapped, his body twisted as if the earth itself had claimed him. Neighbors shook their heads. Fog, a startled horse, a tragic fall. They spoke of fate, not malice. At the funeral, Bridget wore black lace and carried herself with perfect dignity. She wept just enough, her tears timed like punctuation marks. Townsfolk whispered of her misfortune, pitying the poor widow who had lost her husband so soon. No one questioned the inheritance papers she filed days later, securing her claim to the farm. Catherine watched her sister perform grief like a master actress. "You see," she whispered to Margaret, "the world believes what it wishes, and it wishes to believe in sorrow." Margaret said nothing. Her journal, hidden beneath her cloak, already bore the truth. She had written of the vial, of the plan, of Bridget's unflinching calm. Each word cut deeper than the last. Sarah, meanwhile, was undone. At night, she wept until her pillow was soaked, whispering prayers for Hennessy's soul. Once, in the dark, she confessed to Margaret, "I see his face when I close my eyes. God will not forgive us. He will not." Margaret wanted to agree, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she stroked Sarah's hair and held her as she trembled. The turning point had come, and none of them could deny it. The pact was no longer a whisper in the storm. It had blood in its roots now, or at least the stain of it. Bridget's authority grew colder, sharper. Catherine grew bolder, eyes already on her next target. Sarah shrank into herself, her innocence eroding like sand under tide. And Margaret felt the walls close in. Her pen could not keep pace with her dread. She knew, with a certainty that shook her to the bone, that the first death would not be the last. Outside, the fog lifted, leaving the land bare and ordinary once more. But inside the farmhouse, something had shifted forever. The Brennan sisters had crossed the threshold, and there was no return. Winter pressed down on Lancaster like a clenched fist. The fields froze hard, Mill Creek glazed into glass, and the Brennan farmhouse huddled against the wind like a fortress. Inside, the sisters carried themselves with a new gravity. Bridget was no longer simply eldest. She was the widow Brennan, commanding respect in town. But that respect came with whispers, faint and unfinished, like smoke that never quite vanished. Catherine saw the danger before Bridget did. Pity was powerful, but pity soured if repeated too often. One death could be dismissed as tragedy. Two would look like a pattern. And so Catherine decided the next move must be hers. Hamilton Crawford was a banker of exacting habits. He balanced accounts with ruthless precision and judged people as carefully as ledgers. To many in town, he was intimidating. To Catherine, he was opportunity. He was wealthy, respected, and unmarried. Most of all, he was curious, too curious. He had already asked Bridget a few questions about Hennessy's estate, questions Bridget had brushed aside with icy dignity. Catherine charmed him easily. She let her laughter ripple at his stiff remarks, praised his diligence, flattered his austerity until it softened into pride. Within weeks, he was calling at the farmhouse regularly, always with some excuse. Papers to discuss, a loan to adjust, a neighbor's account to verify. But his eyes lingered on Catherine, not the documents. Margaret watched with unease. Every visit, she saw Crawford's gaze sharpen, as if he sensed more beneath the surface. She noticed him watching the sisters when he thought no one saw. Once, she caught him scanning Bridget's handwriting on an old ledger, frowning faintly. Margaret scribbled the moment into her journal that night. He is a man who sees too much. Catherine toys with him, but he is not easily fooled. Sarah, meanwhile, was unraveling. The foggy morning of Hennessy's death replayed endlessly in her mind. She woke at night sobbing, whispering his name. She refused to enter the parlor where Bridget stored his books. During Mass, she clutched the pew so tightly her knuckles whitened. After confession one Sunday, she returned pale and shaking. "The priest knows," she whispered to Margaret in the carriage. "He must know. He asked too many questions. God is showing him." Margaret soothed her, but fear gnawed at her too. She herself felt God's eyes on them, heavy and inescapable. Each night, she opened her journal with trembling hands, writing confessions no priest would ever hear. Catherine's courtship with Crawford moved swiftly. By Christmas, he proposed, presenting her with a modest ring that looked small against her delicate hand. Catherine accepted with a graceful smile, though her eyes gleamed with victory. Bridget congratulated her with rare warmth. "You've done well," she said, clasping Catherine's hand. "Together, our strength grows." But Margaret saw something else in Catherine's face that night. Not just ambition, but delight in the game itself. Catherine was not enduring this pact for survival. She was beginning to relish it. The wedding was small but attended by half the county's notables. In the candlelit church, Catherine glowed with practiced innocence, her veil falling like a curtain over schemes no one suspected. Crawford looked proud, almost softened, though his jaw stayed tense even as he kissed her hand. Margaret recorded the image in her mind, the predator and the prey, arm in arm, both thinking themselves in control. Life with Crawford, however, was not like Hennessy. The banker noticed things. He noticed how Bridget asked after his ledgers. He noticed Sarah's silence, Margaret's unease. He noticed Catherine's sudden insistence on winter walks along the frozen creek, a place no prudent man would wander. And he wrote it all down. Margaret discovered his journal by accident one evening when Catherine left the study door ajar. She had gone to fetch a candle, but froze when she saw the open book on Crawford's desk. The entries chilled her. Lines about Bridget's questions, Catherine's charm, strange coincidences around Hennessy's fall. The words, "I suspect," repeated more than once. Her hands shook as she flipped pages. He was close, too close. Margaret slipped out before Catherine returned, her chest pounding. That night, she wrote in her own journal, "If Crawford dies, suspicion will not fall away this time. It will cling. It will spread. But Catherine will not stop. Bridget will not allow her to stop." And she was right. A week later, Catherine coaxed Crawford onto the frozen creek. She laughed, tossed snow like a child, insisted the ice was safe. Crawford followed, frowning but unwilling to deny his bride. Margaret watched from the bank, Sarah beside her, both too far to intervene. The crack was faint but unmistakable. Crawford plunged through, his crime muffled by water and ice. Catherine screamed convincingly, dropping to her knees as neighbors rushed from the fields. They pulled him out too late. His body, blue and rigid, was laid on the bank as Catherine wept with terrifying grace. The county mourned again, but this time the whispers grew louder. 2 husbands, both wealthy, both dead within months of marriage to Brennan's sisters? Even pity had its limits. Bridget tightened her control. She scolded Margaret for her silence, scolded Sarah for her trembling, scolded Catherine for weeping too theatrically. "We cannot falter now," she said, her voice like steel. "We hold together, or we are undone." But Margaret could feel the net closing. She saw suspicion in the neighbor's eyes, in the priest's furrowed brow, in the way Crawford's clerks lingered too long at the funeral. Most of all, she felt it in herself, the certainty that their pact was leading them not to survival, but to ruin. That night, as snow drifted against the farmhouse walls, Margaret wrote by candlelight, "This is no longer survival. This is hunger." Catherine smiles at death. Bridget commands it. Sarah drowns in guilt. And I, God forgive me, I am the witness who says nothing. But one day, silence will no longer be enough. The journal lay heavy on her lap, the ink smudging where her hand trembled. She looked toward her sister's rooms, where shadows moved beneath doorframes, each one bearing secrets too large for their bodies to contain. The farmhouse was no longer simply a home. It had become a stage, and Margaret knew the final act was approaching. The noose was tightening, whether her sisters admitted it or not. And in the silence between gusts of winter wind, she thought she could hear Crawford's voice whispering from beneath the ice, "I know." The farmhouse never slept the same after Crawford's death. Silence pressed against the walls like snowdrifts, heavy and suffocating. Sarah rarely left her bed, her prayers muttered feverishly until her lips bled. Catherine drifted through the rooms with a strange, gleaming light in her eyes, humming as if she carried a private song. Bridget kept order with iron precision, her every step echoing like a gavel. But Margaret felt her soul cracking. Every page of her journal now read like a confession carved into her bones. Each entry deepened her guilt. The vial on the table, the foggy morning, the ice breaking beneath Crawford, the rehearsed tears. She could no longer convince herself this was survival. It was something darker, something hungry. One evening, she sat alone in her room, the journal open in her lap. Candlelight danced across the ink, the words blurring through her tears. She whispered aloud, to no one but herself, "If I keep silent, I am complicit. If I speak, I destroy my blood. Either way, God will not forgive me." The floor creaked. She turned sharply. Judge Cornelius Whitman stood in the doorway. His figure filled the frame, grave and steady. He had been calling at the farmhouse more often, his interest in Margaret gentle but persistent. His eyes, sharp from years of parsing lies in the courtroom, lingered on the journal. "You write often," he said. His voice was low, calm. "What do you write?" Margaret's throat tightened. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with trembling hands, she held the journal out to him. "Read." He took it carefully, as though it were something burning. He sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, eyes moving line by line, page by page. The candle guttered between them, casting shadows that seemed to flinch from the truth. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, his jaw set. "My God," he whispered. Margaret buried her face in her hands. "I cannot carry it anymore." Whitman closed the journal with a soft thud. "You've carried enough. Now let the law bear it." She lifted her head, fear and defiance mingling in her eyes. "The law will hang them. They are my sisters." "The law spares no one," he said gently. Then, after a pause, "But it spares truth. And truth must live, even if blood does not." That night, Margaret slept for the first time in weeks. 2 days later, the farmhouse became a stage for the reckoning. The sisters gathered in the parlor, where firelight flickered across the coffin-dark wood of their father's old furniture. Outside, snow fell steadily, muffling the world. Bridget stood by the hearth, her posture regal, her widow's black gown immaculate. Catherine lounged in a chair, toying with her ring, her eyes glinting with secret amusement. Sarah knelt in the corner, rosary clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned bone white. Margaret entered last, Whitman at her side. The journal was in his hand. Bridget's eyes narrowed. "Why is he here?" Margaret's chest tightened. She forced her voice steady. "Because truth is here." Whitman placed the journal on the table. Its leather cover gleamed in the firelight. Catherine's smile faltered. Bridget's jaw clenched. Sarah let out a low, strangled cry. "What is this?" Bridget demanded. Margaret's voice broke. "Everything. Every plan. Every deed. It's written. It cannot be denied anymore." For a long, searing silence, only the fire crackled. Then Catherine laughed softly, bitterly. So the quiet one finally opens her mouth. Bridget's voice was sharp as steel. "Do you know what you've done?" "Yes," Margaret whispered. "I've ended it." But Bridget was already moving. She strode to the table, snatched up the journal, and held it above the flames. Margaret cried out, lunging forward, but Whitman was faster. His hand clamped over Bridget's wrist, his voice booming like a verdict. "Not tonight." The door burst open before another word could be spoken. Snow swirled into the parlor as boots stamped across the floor. Federal marshals filled the doorway, torches blazing, rifles gleaming. At their head was Marshal William Davies, his coat powdered with snow, his eyes unflinching. "Bridget Brennan, Catherine Brennan, Sarah Brennan," he declared. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The room exploded into chaos. Sarah screamed, collapsing to the floor. Catherine leapt to her feet, her charm disintegrating into fury. Bridget, unshaken, straightened her back and spoke with chilling clarity. "This is a lie. My sisters are grieving women. That man," she stabbed a finger at Whitman, "he has planted this slander. He seeks to ruin us." The marshals did not flinch. Whitman stepped forward, the journal clutched in his hands. "This book is testimony enough. Names, dates, methods, and corroborated by the late banker's own journal." Catherine's voice rose, shrill and venomous. "She lies." She turned on Margaret, her face twisted with betrayal. "You Judas. You chose him over us." Margaret's tears burned hot down her cheeks. "I chose what was left of my soul." Bridget's composure cracked then, for the first time. Fury ripped through her mask. She lunged at Margaret, fingers curled like claws, but the marshals seized her arms and dragged her back. Her scream was not grief, not denial. It was rage, deep and feral. "You are no sister of mine," she spat at Margaret. "May you burn for this." Sarah sobbed uncontrollably, clinging to Catherine's skirts as the marshals pulled them apart. Catherine fought like a wildcat, her beauty distorted into something raw, vicious. Bridget went cold and rigid, her eyes locked on Margaret like blades. Margaret stood trembling, her body quaking, her face streaked with tears. But she did not step back. For once in her life, she did not yield to Bridget's command. The marshals shackled the sisters, the chains clinking like iron prayers. Whitman placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, steadying her as her world shattered around her. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and silent, covering the earth as though trying to hide the violence within the farmhouse. The sisters were led into the night, their cries fading into the wind. Margaret remained in the parlor long after, staring at the empty chairs, the abandoned rosary on the floor, the fire slowly dying in the hearth. The journal lay on the table, its cover scorched where Bridget had tried to burn it. It was over, and yet nothing was over. She whispered into the silence, her voice breaking. "Father, forgive us." The only answer was the hiss of the fire as it collapsed into ash. The trial was held in Philadelphia, far from Lancaster's farm lanes and gossiping neighbors. The city's courthouse loomed like a cathedral of stone, its tall windows swallowing daylight, and its oak benches packed with spectators. The Brennan name had become a fascination, whispered in taverns, printed in newspapers, dissected in parlors. 4 sisters, 4 deaths, one farm at the center of it all. Bridget walked into the courtroom as if she owned it. Even in shackles, her presence dominated. Her back was straight, her widow's veil drawn tight, her eyes unflinching. Catherine followed with a grace so practiced it seemed unnatural, her beauty only sharpened by the circumstances, her mouth curved in a smile that mocked the jury itself. Sarah stumbled in pale and trembling, clutching her rosary until her fingers bled. Margaret entered last, unshackled, flanked by Whitman. She kept her eyes low, shame pressing her into the floor. The proceedings stretched on for weeks. Witnesses spoke of fog and horses, of ledgers and ice, of words overheard and tears rehearsed. The coroner described bruises that didn't fit with accidents. Bank clerks swore that Crawford had expressed suspicion. And then came the journals, 2 of them, Crawford's neat lines of unease and Margaret's anguished confessions. The courtroom shifted when the journals were read aloud. The entries laid bare not only events but emotions, the sisters' pact, the vial on the table, Margaret's torment. People leaned forward as if hearing a ghost speak. Some pitied Margaret. Others despised her for waiting so long to betray her blood. But none could deny the truth inked on those pages. When the verdict was delivered, silence fell heavy. Bridget Brennan, guilty. Catherine Brennan, guilty. Sarah Brennan, guilty. Each word struck like a hammer. The sentence was death by hanging. Margaret was spared, granted immunity for her cooperation. But her face did not lighten. If anything, her sorrow deepened, as though the chains her sisters wore had been shifted invisibly onto her own shoulders. The execution was set for a March morning, cold and brittle. Crowds gathered as if for a festival, faces flushed, voices hushed. 3 gallows had been erected side by side. There would stark against the pale sky. Bridget mounted the steps first. Her head was high, her voice calm as she declared to the crowd, "We are no monsters. We are daughters who refuse to bow. Judge us as you will. History will know the truth." Her words cut the air like iron. Catherine followed, lips curved in a final smirk. "If men may take lives in war and be praised, why not women in survival?" she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "We did only what was necessary." Sarah was last. She wept openly, whispering prayers, her body shaking so violently she had to be half carried up the steps. Her cries pierced the murmuring crowd, some of whom turned away, unable to watch. The nooses were placed. The crowd held its breath. When the trapdoors fell, time seemed to stop. The sound of ropes snapping taut echoed against the buildings. 3 figures swung in unison, their bodies outlined against the morning sky. Some gasped, some crossed themselves, some cheered. Margaret closed her eyes and pressed her face into Whitman's coat, unable to watch, yet unable to escape the sound that would haunt her forever. The sisters were buried in unmarked graves at the city's edge. The farm they had fought to preserve was auctioned, its fields parceled to strangers. Within a decade, the farmhouse was torn down, the stone carted away to build new barns and shops. The land that had cost so many lives became nothing more than property lines on someone else's map. Years later, Margaret lived quietly in another town under another name. She and Whitman never spoke of the farmhouse, though both carried it in silence. She no longer wrote in journals. Her pen had become a blade she could not bear to wield again. Instead, she kept her words locked inside her chest, heavy as stones. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, she dreamed of her sisters. Bridget, stern and commanding, staring at her with eyes that accused. Catherine, smiling like a cat, her laughter echoing. Sarah, weeping and praying, reaching out with trembling hands. In the dream, they always stood in the farmhouse kitchen, candlelight on their faces, glasses raised in that first oath. She woke each time with tears on her cheeks and the taste of whiskey in her mouth. though she had not drunk in years. The story of the Brennan sisters lingered. Children in Lancaster whispered it by firelight, daring each other to speak their names after dark. Preachers used it as a warning, spinning sermons about greed and sin. And still, others told it differently. Of women who defied a law that sought to strip them, who chose violence over surrender. Villains to some, martyrs to others. The truth lived somewhere in the shadows between. Margaret never corrected the stories. She carried the silence like penance. But sometimes, when she walked past a churchyard or a field of winter corn, she thought she heard faint sounds behind her. The clink of a glass, the creak of rope, the echo of her sister's voices carried on the wind. She never turned to look. The farmhouse is gone now. Where it once stood, children play in the parking lot of a shopping center. Cars idle where horses once grazed. The soil is paved, the stones buried, the memory almost erased. Almost. For there are nights, locals say, when the air turns thick with fog and the lot falls strangely silent. On those nights, a horse can be heard galloping, frantic and riderless, its scream tearing through the dark. Others swear they hear women's voices, rising in a broken toast, glasses clinking faintly before vanishing into the cold. No one stays long when the fog rolls in. Margaret's last words, written in a letter never sent, were found after her death. I was not innocent. I was only silent. And silence, too, is a crime. The letter ends there, the ink smudged, the rest of the page blank. And so the story ends, not with the land preserved, nor the sisters united, but with echoes that refuse to fade. A pact sworn in candlelight, a farm soaked in grief, and a silence that still lingers, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. E1.